Mr. Galvin, why don't we start with perhaps the kinds of things that come to mind most immediately for you when you think about Joe Juran?
The way I picture Joe Juran is that he is an indefatigable inspiration.
No one else has said that.
Okay.
He has certainly been around for a long time and stayed pretty true to the road that he's been down. One of the things that he mentioned was that when you accepted the first Baldrige Award, that you were most complimentary to Joe Juran. What caused you to say? Would you repeat what you said at the award ceremony and tell us a little bit why you said it?
Well, I don't recall what I said at the ceremony, and I don't know whether or not I said anything directly about Joe Juran at the ceremony itself. But what I generically recall is that I paid my respects to the pioneers who had early on given us the instinct for quality and the reinforcement that what we were striving to do had to be right because they had stayed the course. And Joe Juran was a premier leader and role model at that time and has continued, of course, to be. And I have commented that on a number of occasions, and I doubtless comment on it at and about the time of the receipt of the award.
What do you think has kept Joe Juran on his course, particularly in the United States when not an awful lot of people were listening for the periods probably from the early 50s, probably into the mid-60s?
I think Joe Juran has an essential wisdom, and I think he had thought out the value and the merit of the quality theme and the quality systems needs for our society. And I think he must have had an instinctive belief that eventually we would finally catch up with him and ally with his objective and try to implement some of those things. My guess is that Joe Juran in recent years has taken heart that some of that's begun to work. And when we achieve, we of course reinforce our enthusiasms again. I think that Joe is not a quitter. He's a fighter. He stands up for the little things as well as the big things. And I guess I've seen him more engaged in some of the more modest things that reinforce quality, and he's been a stickler. He's stayed with his values at the highest level, and he would not let any of us who might want to compromise at the wrong time. Joe was a good political essayist, but he doesn't play politics. But he thinks he knows what's possible, and I think he's worked the possible right to the finest edge.
We took a trip to Japan and spoke to a number of the people in the same way that Dr. Juran worked with shortly after the Second World War. And one of the men said that Dr. Juran is sort of uniquely a philosopher on the subject of quality, and not just simply a practitioner or a technician of quality. How would you say the word philosopher applies to Joe Juran?
Well, if one of the working definitions of a philosopher is one that is seeking to understand what and why, Joe is a fundamentalist. And I believe he has understood the essence of quality and those who would be the practitioners of it. And I think he's been able to explain the what and the why by understanding who we were and what we needed to know. So yes, I'd say Joe has had he is a philosopher, he's had a philosophy, and he's had a deep belief.
The people of Japan said that he has made a remarkable contribution to Japan as a country. We've spoken to someone from Australia who said that Joe Juran has made an enormous contribution to the society, culture, the wealth, if you will, of Australia, turning it from agriculture and farming and ranching country to manufacturing. Could the same be said about Joe Juran's contribution to society here in the United States?
I'm not able to evaluate the degree of his influence in some of these non-U.S. Locations, but I can't imagine that as effective as his influence has been outside of the United States, that it could come anywhere near measuring what I believe is the paramount impact that he's had in the United States. He has impacted a large number of us, and whether or not he has had then the direct influence on some others, his influence has radiated through some of the rest of us. So I look upon Joe Juran as having had an inestimable impact on the United States.
It had to be very brave of you and people in your position to say, we will stop doing business as usual. We will take people off assembly lines. We will teach people how to do things differently than they used to do them. We will allow people to recognize that perhaps they weren't working optimally before. How big an acknowledgement was that to make, and how difficult a decision?
Well, I don't know how hard it is for some other corpus bodies to make those kinds of changes. That wasn't so hard here. We had another influence, and that was the influence of my father. And my father was one who was very willing to admit a mistake, and never liked people who were numb, who stayed with things that were wrong. And so we've been guided by the essential principle of renewal. That made it easy for us to look to the better ideas from the Joe Jurans and to embrace them when we understood them. So we weren't troubled by these changes too much. There are always individuals in an institution who may have more difficulty than others, but that's the range of human nature and our various qualities. But as an institution, we reached out to change, and we heard from many people, but certainly from Joe among others, that this was a change that was essential, and they were convincing.
We know that Joe Juran has spent almost as much time talking about the human impact on a shift to a quality-oriented culture as on the technological shifts. How unique is that point of view, where to look at the humanistic side of the quality culture?
Well, it's absolutely essential. In the case of my relationship with Joe, I don't know that we have dwelt on that subject in great detail, which I would incidentally credit him in a very special way. I think Joe has an instinct in guessing that people have estimated somewhat in his quadrant, at which point all he does is reinforce versus preach. And I think that's one of the interesting qualities of Joe Juran, is that he builds on what is there and doesn't feel that he has to be redundant on everything that he does. As a consequence, I found Joe to be immensely effective in a lot of quarters. We spent a lot of time at meetings of the Board of Governors of the Baldrige Award. And Joe would sit back and wait until the leverage point needed to be made, and he always had it.
Has he ever surprised you? A lot of people have said that, my God, he's sort of like a mind like a file cabinet. You bring up some subject and you can just see the drawer open and the folder get withdrawn and the papers get riffled through. Have you ever astounded or surprised you in that regard?
Yes, surprise sounds immensely exciting, but I was always pleased and benefited by the fact that Joe would recall something from one of the meetings like almost a human minutes of such affairs, and he would find the exception that some of the rest of us had dropped, and that would finally fill out the makeup of that past agenda. So he seems to have a remarkable memory and a remarkable ability to correlate that which he dealt with, and then he has no qualms about calling that to our attention graciously but firmly, and thus we go ahead and proceed to accomplish what had been promised but forgotten.
One of the things that he mentioned to me was that he remembered most warmly was an airplane ride he shared with you, I guess, from Washington to Atlanta. And what sort of struck him was that how two people from such diverse backgrounds could find such a strong relationship and a common ground. And, do you recall at all about what that trip was about?
I regrettably do not recall the discussion. I recall that we were together, and I recall that when we got on the airplane, we probably both wondered, would we spend half the time reading our book or newspaper? And we got to where we were chatting with such vigor that the plane ride was over before either one of us knew it was over. And probably we didn't finish the discussion. But no, I'm sorry, I don't have a recollection of the direct contents. It was a beautiful and an enthusiastic discussion. I do recall that very well.
In 20 years, the history of this period will be written by somebody. What do you think the historians will write about Joe Juran and his contribution to the world?
Well, I think Joe was a fundamentalist on a very significant piece of institutional wisdom that could affect corporations and other kinds of operating institutions. But I focus on it from the standpoint of the private sector class of institution. And I think that Joe embedded these fundamental principles in people who otherwise would not have caught the message. And therefore, he's made many of us stronger, and then we could help implement a stronger country. So his effect has really been radiant.
What's been sort of interesting is, after we saw you last, we've gone out and obviously talked to many companies and organizations of various types. And the pioneering work that you've done has spread into places like the healthcare industry, and even now moving into the legal culture. How is it that cultures that are so different, and here at Motorola there's a strong centralized leadership. Law firms are, for example, a collection of individuals who are somewhat entrepreneurial. Where do you think the commonalities of interest are? How has what you started, how can that serve as a value to something as perhaps strange as a law firm?
Well, to me, the common link is that most people are good, and one of the definitions of good is that they would like to achieve, and if they are both given the opportunity to achieve and the means to achieve, they'll reach out to achieve. And quality is something that is measurable as a very significant achievement, and many things rally around quality. So I don't think it makes much difference whether we're in a law firm or in a public agency or a corporation. I'm seeing people in all of those walks of life that once they're given the head and the hint as to how to get there, they'll reach out pretty strong and try to accomplish that.
But one of the things that we're finding is that so many people and organizations don't have the patience to stick with the process long enough to really start to see the enormous level of payback that's really there in mind.
Well, if there is an impatience to follow through, I would speculate and estimate that is a function of a failure at the top of whatever that institution is, a major department or a corporation or an agency. And that if the people in the institution detect there's an impatience at the top, they will respond. If they recognize that there is a confidence level that a determined effort will eventually pay off, I think most people are willing to do that. Within our institution, the most receptive group of people are the people who are the actual doers. They have a patience to do things right. Just give us a chance, they say. And so the leadership who can be influenced by a Joe Juran have to be inculcated with a role modelship for such patience.
There are many, many articles about quality in virtually all kinds of publications. Here, and we've discovered in Japan as well. This may not be a fair question, and you may not want to handle it, but in the popular press, you get the sense that there's this sort of entity called a Juran-Deming, or a Deming-Juran, that somehow cohesively created the quality revolution in the world. Two halves of the same basketball, the same grapefruit. In point of fact, is there an ability to differentiate what significant contributions Deming made to the quality revolution and what Joe Juran did?
I'm not an analyst of the principal factors that each of those two gentlemen have contributed, so I can only take slices of that issue. The fact that Mr. Deming has devoted a good deal of his energies and been effective with the Japanese represents a contribution of making a competitor a stimulation to some of the rest of us to become much better. I don't know whether that's a convoluted way of making a unique contribution to America in that particular aspect of his contribution. And Mr. Deming's identification with the Japanese success is obviously somewhat more in the public eye. Mr. Deming has taught some very particular procedures, and I admire what he has caused to be achieved. Joe Juran's thesis has, in my estimation, been a little bit more accommodatable to the American psyche and to the American character. And thus, those of us who have a certain independence of efforts in quality probably can identify more readily with both the combination of principle and the flexibility of the application of those principles, which I detect comes somewhat more from Joe Juran. Americans are using both, and I gather some Japanese are using both. But I think that we need diversity in our philosophies and in our teachings, as long as we're both aiming for the same high standards.
Do we need a crisis to pursue quality? The Japanese did after the Second World War, and clearly many American corporations did more recently.
I guess the answer is mostly yes. We do need a crisis to make sea changes of one kind or another. And the Japanese had a crisis of their own, and by becoming better, they created a crisis over here, and we're all getting better.
How do you sustain interest, enthusiasm, and motivation when the crisis passes?
Well, I think it comes from fundamental beliefs, and in our case, we just keep recharging our energies, recognizing that our beliefs are paying off in tangible results, in satisfaction results, in influences on others who relate with us, like suppliers and customers. And my guess is that this is almost as close to a self-perpetuation machine as one can have.
The last question before I ask Howland if you'd like to open the door to other questions. Why should the American people be even the slightest bit interested in watching a television program on the life of Joseph Juran?
Well, if American people like the life story of a man who came from very modest means, who succeeded, who had values like their neighbors next door, and then did something extraordinary, I think they would like the story of Joe Juran. And I think that Joe Juran is, quote, our kind of people. And we'd probably like to hear about our kind of people.
Howland?
Yeah, to finish the sentence, Joe
Yeah.
Juran. I think that's
The very last question. As you finish the sentence, Joe Juran is.
Joe Juran is an indefatigable inspiration to those who like to achieve.
Thank you, sir.
Okay?
Wonderful.
Okay, well, I hope a little of that's helpful to Joe and to you.
Oh,